Before we start working with real users, there are a few ethical considerations we have to make. If you're doing research as part of a university, these are part of your contract with the university to do research on their behalf. Even if you're doing research independently or in industry, there are still ethical obligations to follow. These considerations are important not only to preserve the rights of our users, but also to ensure the value of the data that we gather. In this lesson, we'll talk a little bit about where these kinds of ethical considerations came from. Then we'll talk about some of the basic ethical considerations that we need to make. We'll also talk about Institutional Review Board, or IRB, the university organization that governs human subjects research. In the first half of the 20th century, a number of pretty clearly unethical human subjects experiments took place. Many of them were conducted by scientists working for the Axis powers during World War II, but famously many were also conducted right here in our own backyard here in the United States. Among them were Milgram's obedience experiment, where participants were tricked into thinking that they had administered lethal shocks to other participants to see how obedient they would be. There was the Tuskegee syphilis study, where rural African American men were intentionally injected with syphilis to study its progression. And there was the Stanford Prison experiment, where participants were psychologically abused to test their limits or test how they would act under different circumstances. In response to all this, the National Research Act of 1974 was passed, which led to the creation of institutional review boards to oversee research at universities. The Belmont Report further summarizes basic ethical principles that research must follow in order to receive government support. Among other things, the law dictated that the benefits to society must outweigh the risks to the subjects in the case of these experiments. It also dictated that subjects must be selected fairly, which was a direct response to the Tuskegee syphilis study. And perhaps most importantly, it demanded rigorous informed consent procedures, so that participants know what they're getting into and can back out at any time. These efforts all attempt to make sure that the positive results of research outweigh the negatives and that participant rights are always preserved. In this lesson, we're largely focusing on the practical steps we go through to get approval for human subjects research. But before we get into that, I want to highlight that this isn't just a bunch of bureaucratic steps necessary to make sure that people are treated ethically at all stages of research. IRB's main task is to make sure the potential benefits of a study are worth the potential risks. So as part of that, part of their role is to make sure the potential benefits are significant. A lot of the steps of the process are going to ensure that the data that we gather is useful. So for example, the IRB is sensitive about the perception of coercion. When participants feel coerced to participate in research, the data they actually supply may be skewed by that negative perception, which impacts our results. Similarly, we might design studies that have some inherent biases or issues to them. We might demand too much from participants or ask questions that are known to affect our results. Much of the initial training to be certified to perform research is similarly not just about doing ethical research, but also about doing good research. By recording who is certified, IRB helps ensure that research personnel all understand the basics of human subjects research. IRB is also there to monitor for these things as well, and many of the steps of this process ensure that the research we perform is sound and useful. After all, if the research we perform is not useful, then even the smallest risks will outweigh the non-existent benefits. If you're going to be doing research as part of a university project or a university class, you need IRB approval. Different universities have different processes and policies for getting started with IRB. We're going to discuss the Georgia Tech policy since that's where this class is based, but you should check with your university if you're from somewhere else to make sure you're following the right policies for your school. To get started, we need to complete the required training. So here I'm showing the IRB website, which is researchintegrity.gottech.edu/IRB. And to get started, you need to complete your required training. So click Required Training over on the left. This will take you to a page that overviews the IRB required training and gives you a link on the left to begin your city training. So click that, then log into your Georgia Tech account. And you're going to want to complete Group 2 Social and Behavioral Research Investigators and Key Personnel. I can't show you exactly what it looks like to sign up fresh because I've already completed it, but you should be able to add a course and add that as your course. After you've completed city training, you'll receive your completion report, and then you'll be ready to get started with IRB. After you've completed any necessary training, you can access the IRB application for your own university. We're doing this in terms of Georgia Tech, so here's the tool we use called IRBWise. Here, under My Protocols, you'll see a list of all the protocols to which you're added. A protocol is a description of a particular research project. It outlines the procedures that the IRB has approved regarding consent, recruitment, experimentation, and more. Here we see approved protocols, protocols that are new and haven't been submitted yet, protocols that are waiting for the IRB to act on them, and amendments to protocols. Amendments are how we change earlier protocols to add new researchers or change what we're approved to do. After a protocol is approved, any changes must be submitted to the IRB as an amendment to be accepted separately. Generally speaking, you might not ever be asked to complete a protocol yourself. You might instead just be added to an existing protocol. Still, you need to make sure to understand the procedures outlined by any protocol to which you're added because they still govern what you do. So we'll run through the process of creating a protocol, but this will also cover the details to know about any protocol to which you're added. So for this, I have a draft protocol covering our user study on people who exercise. Every protocol starts with the title of the protocol and some certified personnel. These are required just to save the protocol. We add approved research personnel on the study personnel page. We would enter their name, select their role, and if their certification isn't already in the system, we would attach it here. After adding them, they'll appear down here. The primary investigator, PI, must always be added first, and it must be a faculty member. The protocol description covers the study at a high level. This should briefly touch on what will be done, what the goal of the research is, and what subjects will be asked to do. It doesn't cover all the details, but it covers enough for someone to understand generally what we're going for with this study. Under the Research Design and Methodology section, we describe our research. First, we describe the research design and the methodology. With human subjects research, this focuses on what users will experience and in what order. It also covers some experimental details like how subjects might be assigned different experimental conditions. Then we describe the duration of subject participation to make sure subjects aren't being asked to do too much. Depending on what we're doing, we may then need to provide data collection methods. This includes things like surveys, pre-tests and post-tests, interview scripts, anything pre-prepared to elicit data from the participant. Then we also need to describe the potential benefits of the study. Remember, IRB is about making sure that the benefits outweigh the risks. If there are no benefits, then the benefits can't outweigh the risks. Benefits don't need to be to the individual participants, though, but they could be to the greater community as a whole. Similarly, we also need to describe the risks associated with the study. For usability studies, very often our risks are not going to be very significant. Our risks might be those associated with normal work at a computer. But we still need to address this to acknowledge that we've thought about what risks might arise to participants. Then we describe the plan for the statistical analysis if we have one. Qualitative research might not have a statistical analysis plan, so that's why I've left this blank. Finally, we need to describe the start and end dates of the research. Very often, this will break the research into a data collection phase and a research phase where we actually analyze the data that we collected. Now, we won't generally need to worry about many of the remaining options on this form because we're not doing clinical studies and we generally don't have external funding unless you're working on a professor's research project. So now let's move on to subject details. Because we're interested in human-computer interaction, we almost certainly will have human-subject interaction. So when it asks, will the research involve direct interaction with human subjects, we would click yes. That will bring us to a screen where we describe our subjects and the data we plan to collect from them. First, they want to know how many subjects we have and what genders. They want to make sure that we're not wasting participants' time if we're not going to actually analyze all their data, and that we're being fair to the different genders. A common problem in early research was overrepresenting male populations. Second, they'll want to know if we're targeting any vulnerable populations, people that might not have the capacity to give true informed consent. If we do, we need to make special accommodations to make sure they're fully aware of their rights as participants. Third, they want the scientific justification for the number of subjects to enroll in our study. Like I said, they want to make sure that we're not going to waste the time of a bunch of participants and then just throw their data out. That wouldn't be very respectful for our participants' time. If we're doing statistical tests, this might be the number of participants necessary to find a certain effect size, which we'll talk about when we talk about quantitative research. If we're doing qualitative research, this is usually a smaller number and is more based on how many different perspectives we need to get a good picture of what we're trying to analyze. Alternatively, we might have external limits on our number of participants. For example, if you're doing classroom research, your maximum number of students is the maximum number of students in the class. Next, we state the inclusion and exclusion criteria. The inclusion criteria are who are we specifically including, who's our target audience. The exclusion criteria are those that we're specifically excluding. Oftentimes, one of these will just be the inverse of the other, but there may be times when we need to be more specific. For example, if we were doing research on undergraduate computer science education, our inclusion criteria might be undergraduate students, but our exclusion criteria would be undergraduate students that have previously taken a computer science class. As before, we can skip the questions, for our purposes at least, that are more based on clinical research, but at the bottom we need to provide the steps necessary to ensure additional protection of the rights and welfare of vulnerable populations. For example, if we're working with 10-year-olds, how do we make sure 10-year-olds really understand that they really do have the right to opt out of this research? We need to provide a plan for that here if we're working with a vulnerable population. Finally, we also need to describe our recruitment procedures. How are we going to find our subjects? First, we'll note what we'll say and how we'll communicate with them here. If we're using the Georgia Tech Subject Pool, which is a system for finding research subjects within the Georgia Tech student body, we'll indicate so here. And last, we'll note the kind of compensation we plan to provide to participants. Many times we won't compensate our participants at all, but if we're doing our bigger research study that actually has some external funding, it's pretty normal to give them some kind of monetary compensation for participation. If we're using the Georgia Tech Subject Pool, our compensation will often be extra credit in a certain class, very often a psychology class. Note that the recruitment procedures are very important, especially if you're doing something like classroom research, where there can be a very significant perception of coercion to get people to participate. If I, as an instructor, am recruiting students in my own class to participate in my research project, I have to be very clear that it won't come back to haunt them if they choose not to participate. One of the most important elements of IRB approval is consent. That was one of the things created by the Belmont Report. If we're doing any interaction with our human subjects, we definitely need to think about consent procedures. On the consent information page, first we need to indicate what kind of consent we'll receive. Most commonly, this will be written consent required. In this case, participants will sign or digitally sign a consent form to start the study, but in some cases, a waiver may be obtained. First, a waiver of consent can be obtained under certain pretty narrow circumstances. This generally means we don't need to receive the subject's consent at all. Most of the time, this only applies when subjects will not be directly affected by the research. So for example, if we wanted to study educational or health data that's already been generated and is already anonymized, we might receive a waiver of consent because those subjects won't be impacted by the fact that we're now researching their data. Similarly, if we were to go sit in a coffee house and just take notes on the order-taking process in a way that didn't identify anyone, we might receive a waiver of consent because our observation is not affecting those people. We might also receive a waiver of documentation of consent. This occurs for low-risk research where the written consent itself would be the only record of the participant's identity. This applies to a lot of survey research or unrecorded interviews where participants can be informed of their rights at the start and their own continued participation constitutes continued implied consent. There's no reason to have them sign a consent form because that consent form is the only reason we'd ever be able to identify them after the study. After selecting our option, we need to provide a justification if we requested a waiver. If we didn't, then no justification is necessary. We'll then describe the plan for obtaining informed consent. Generally, this will be to provide the consent form to participants at the start of the study and make it very clear that they can withdraw from the study at any time. If we're involving children, non-English speakers, or other at-risk populations in our study, there may be some additional boxes to complete. It's also important for us to assess whether participants are continuing to consent to the study. Oftentimes we do this by making it very clear at the start of the study that they can withdraw at any time, so that their continued participation constitutes implied continued consent. Finally, it's also possible to have protocols where deception or concealment is proposed. In HCI, for example, we might want to tell participants that an interface is functioning even if someone behind the scenes is actually just making it look functional, so that we get good research data out of those participants. For example, if we were testing something like a new version of Siri, we might tell participants that it's functioning, when in reality someone is writing the responses by hand. If we're using deception or concealment like that, we'll indicate so here. Then finally, we need to upload our consent forms. At Georgia Tech, the Office of Research Integrity Assurance provides consent form templates that we can tweak to match the specific needs of our study. The templates provide in-depth directions on what to supply. Generally, this is where we disclose to participants the details of the rest of the protocol, what we're researching, why, how, and why they were invited to participate. Of the remaining fields, the only one we're likely interested in is the data management questions. The majority of the others cover either clinical research or biological research or other things that we hopefully won't touch on very much in human-computer interaction unless the field has changed a lot by the time you're listening to this. Nonetheless, though, you should actually peek into those titles to make sure that they don't apply to you if you're filling out a protocol like this. Under the data management section, we'll want to describe how we keep participants' data safe. That'll include descriptions of the way we store identifying information about participants and how we'll safeguard the data itself, like through password protection or encryption or anything like that. Finally, there are always some questions that we answer for all studies, even though they generally won't apply to us. Generally, our studies won't involve the Department of Defense. Generally, they shouldn't involve radiation, and one day I really kind of hope they involve nanotechnology, but we're probably not quite there yet. So we would mark no that there is no DoD involvement. Finally, at the bottom, there's a place to upload some additional documents. This is where we would supply things like an interview script, a survey, a recruitment script, and other documents that the IRB would want to see and approve. When we're done, we can click Save and Continue Application. On the next page, we can preview everything on one flat screen, and then check off at the end that we have no conflicts of interest, or report them if we do. Then we'll click Save and Continue again. And for y'all, you would then submit it to your primary investigator. I am the primary investigator, so I see something a little bit different here than what you would see. After submission, we'll generally hear back from IRB in about 3 weeks about whether the study was accepted and what changes need to be made if not. Institutional review boards govern any research institutions that receive support from the federal government. But what about research that doesn't receive any federal support? Very often, companies will do research on their users. This is especially common in HCI. Lots of companies are constantly doing very interesting testing on their users with a lot of rapid A/B experiments. There's a lot of potential knowledge there, but at the same time, much of what they do likely would not pass IRB if it were university research. This actually came up recently with Facebook in a paper they published titled Experimental Evidence of Massive-Scale Emotional Contagion Through Social Networks. Basically, Facebook wanted to see if they could predict what would make users happy or sad. And as a result, they tweaked the newsfeed for some users to test out their ideas. In other words, they tried to manipulate their users' mood for experimental purposes. Now, Facebook argues that this was consistent with their own data use policy, which permits them to perform experiments like this. Some social scientists, however, would argue that this does not constitute informed consent. Informed consent, they say, is specific to a certain experiment, temporary for a known period of time, and given without coercion. Some would argue that if you don't agree you can't use Facebook, qualifies as coercion. These are some difficult issues, and if you end up working in HCI and industry, you'll likely find yourself wrestling with some of them. People are still discussing whether or not Facebook's study on its impact on users' moods was ethical. Facebook maintains that the study was consistent with its own data use policy, which constitutes informed consent. Opponents argue that it doesn't. What do you think? If you think that this was ethical, why do you think it was ethical? If you think that it was unethical, what could have made it ethical? If you said yes, there are several reasons you might have stated. You might agree that because the terms of service covered it, it was technically ethical research. The users did agree to things like this. You may have actually read the article or read other publications about it and noted that Facebook actually has an internal IRB that reviews things like this. And in this case, an external IRB did review the study. If you said no, the reason you gave may have been that we know users are not aware to what's in the terms of use. We have plenty of studies that indicate that users really don't spend any time reading what they're agreeing to. And while technically it's true that they're still agreeing to it, what we're interested in here are participants' rights. If we know that users aren't reading what they're agreeing to, don't we have an ethical obligation to make sure they're aware before we go ahead with it? We also might say no because users couldn't opt out of this study. Part of that is because opting out of the study alone means deactivating your entire Facebook account or just stopping using the tool. But part of it is that users also weren't aware that a study was now going on. They couldn't opt out of the study specifically, nor could they even opt out of it by closing down their entire Facebook account because they didn't know when the study had started. That ties into the other issue. Users weren't notified that they were participants in an experiment. So even though they technically agreed to it when they agreed to Facebook's terms of service, one could argue the fact that they weren't notified when the study was beginning and ending means that it wasn't ethical research. I'm not going to give you a right or wrong answer to this. There's a very interesting conversation to have about this. But what's most important here are the interesting questions that it brings up, especially in regard to companies doing human subjects research that doesn't have any oversight from the federal government. If you agreed with these reasons why it wasn't ethical, what could they have done to fix it? Maybe they could have separated out the consent process for research studies from the rest of Facebook as a whole. Maybe they could have specifically requested that individual users opt in and alert them when the study was done, but not tell them what's actually being manipulated. And even if the original study was ethical, there were likely things that could have reduced the backlash. At the same time, those things might have affected the results. These are the trade-offs that we deal with. In a recent paper in the Washington and Lee Law Review, Molly Jackman and Lori Canerva, two Facebook employees, explore exactly this issue. Jackman and Canerva specifically note that the ethical guidelines developed in the context of academia do not always address some of the considerations of industry. In response, the authors directly advocate for setting up a set of principles and practices for industry environments. In other words, rather than just ignoring the parts that aren't relevant for industry, the authors advise creating a new set of standards specifically for industry. To do so, Facebook designed its own internal review process. In this case, Facebook's process is heavily reliant on deferring to a research area expert. And I don't say defer in a bad way. A key part of IRB is that experiments are reviewed by people with no incentive to permit the study if it isn't ethical. Facebook tries to replicate this by referring studies to an external reviewer, who in turn decides whether or not an additional review, and even external IRB, is necessary. The other thing that's important to note, though, is that Facebook isn't under any strong obligation to do this. Universities that receive federal funding are governed by the Belmont Report, but companies are not yet governed by any similar law. So we rely on companies to govern themselves. In Facebook's case, it seems to be going pretty well, but you might find yourself at a company that doesn't have such a program, and you'll have to apply these standards yourself. In this lesson, we've talked about research ethics. Research ethics guide the human subjects research we do to make sure we're respecting the rights of our participants, but it also makes sure the data we're gathering is good and useful. At every stage of our design lifecycle, we want to keep respect for our participants at the forefront of our thought. That means being wary of experimenting in ways that might negatively affect users. That also means only asking users to dedicate their time to evaluating interfaces that are well thought out. And that means respecting users' viewpoints and position in the design process.